And when you talk about structure in the context of glass, what do you mean more specifically?
Well, using the baseline for that definition of what structure is, that is something that supports the object or load. In this case, we need to talk about vacuum. So when you remove air from inside of the vessel, you create a low pressure environment. So then we're talking about pressure now. What does that have to do with all of this? Well, pressure is the force that is created when atoms, molecules, or particles strike the walls of their container. The less you have of these particles, the less pressure you have, and vice versa. So again, when we're talking about vacuum, we are comparing the pressure inside of a vessel to which that is outside, known as atmospheric pressure.
Welcome back, or welcome to the Taming Lightning podcast. I'm Percy Echols II. I'm the creator and host of Taming Lightning, as well as the emerging plasma tech at Pittsburgh Glass Center. Taming Lightning podcast features a series of conversations to help expand our understanding of plasma and neon light, looking beyond its associations with novelty and sign making, and to explore the potential for noble gases as an artistic medium. Hello and welcome. Disclaimer coming up here. There's something I have to tell you before we can begin. The information provided by Taming Lightning is designed to provide helpful information and to educate on the subjects discussed. Now, that being said, the information provided is true and complete to the best of our knowledge and is not intended to be used without professional guidance or supervision. All recommendations are made in goodwill of both Taming Lightning and affiliates, to which we disclaim any liability in connection with the use of the information we provide. Thus, we ask that you be informed, be curious, and to ask questions. Let's get to it.
Hello, Lightning Tamers. This is episode number 33. In today's podcast, I'll be joined by Ben Orozco for Chapter 2 of the Intro to Plasma series in collaboration with GEEX, the Glass Education Exchange.
This series is an introduction for glass educators and makers who are new to the process of plasma, as well as an introduction to Percy and his thoughts and experiences on learning about plasma. So, in Chapter 2, Taking Shape, we'll be talking about the fundamental guidelines for creating your forms, aesthetic considerations, and preparing plasma vessels for filling and illumination.
So if you checked out the Chapter 1 notes, I expanded on Chapter 1 and gave a soft introduction to the elements of plasma through the categories of vessel crafting, alchemy, and technology. They'll kind of clarify these categories, which are pretty much newly created constructs. It's just a way to really break down these various facets when working with plasma. So I'm going to kind of break these down, and then Ben's going to jump in with a little bit of knowledge here for us. So the first category is vessel crafting, the means of facilities, education, materials, and techniques related to glass making, containing the topics of vessel shape, structure, size, choice of electrode, along with its placement.
And we can think about this as material knowledge, which is a category that many of you listening are already familiar with in some capacity in your glassmaking, or I guess even just in your material practice.
Right. And then the second category, alchemy, is the means to which a piece can be processed and filled for plasma, containing topics such as cleaning, adding phosphors, filling technique, and gas mixtures and recipes.
And this knowledge is a little bit more intuitive. It's somewhere between material and technical knowledge, and it's something that we gain through time, experience, and some trial and error.
And lastly, the third category is technology, the facilities and the means to learn, educate, and practice processing and filling, and finishing your plasma sculpture, containing topics such as vacuum manifolds, gas transfer systems, gauges, equipment maintenance and use, transformers for plasma, which also includes considerations for resolving your sculptures aesthetically and safely.
And this is the technical knowledge which we can gain through known quantities and tested procedures easily by looking things up. So some of these concepts that Percy brought up might fly over your head for now, but soon you'll understand how all these puzzle pieces fit into place. So why should we talk about vessel crafting first?
Well, Ben, it holds the most variables for what we need to learn to create our vessels. Regarding whether or not you come from a glass or scientific background, vessel crafting is highly underestimated when it comes to navigating plasma. In the areas such as flame working, furnace glass blowing, and kiln working, there's sort of a middle path in which you can kind of follow a set of guidelines, and your process will mostly and ultimately inform how you create your vessels or your envelope.
And first, let's revisit that anatomy of the plasma sculpture or envelope.
Certainly. So the anatomy of plasma sculpture is 4 parts: your glass vessel or glass envelope, gas mixture, electrode, and transformer. Under the category of vessel crafting, we'll be looking at both vessel crafting through vessels and envelope and the electrode. And then we'll discuss more about the vessel and how that comes to play with the gases in Chapter 3.
And how can we define a glass vessel or envelope in the context of plasma?
Well, in plasma, we'll use both terms vessel and envelope interchangeably within this context. If we're looking at the term for vessel, it's a hollow container that contains or holds liquids or solids. Note that our learning process for glass originates in creating a vessel, whether that's creating a bubble, a cup, a cylinder, a tumbler, a vase, a bowl, or a plate, all things containing objects. But then if we want something more accurate or more on point, that would be using the term envelope, originating from the subject of vacuum tubes and electric lights, which could be defined as a sealable container that holds liquids, solids, or gases. And our emphasis here is on being able to contain gases.
Mm-hmm. And why would you say glass is important for our vessel or envelope? Why encase it in that and not another material?
Well, glass is important in this process, and we're not bringing up glass just because it's something that we manipulate as artists and makers, but it transmits light very well. It has a high melting point to which it resists the heat of plasma. And for our needs, which must be able to permanently contain those gases, it's proven to be the best material. So to effectively contain those gases and the resulting plasma, it must be an inert material like glass. Plastics, common glues, epoxies, or silicones have properties that when placed under vacuum or under heat will break down and contaminate your vessel, ultimately snuffing out your light.
And that's pretty interesting that despite how many high-tech materials we're surrounded with, we keep coming back to this material and process. So what's the most important aspect that we should think about when we're making these glass vessels for plasma? What's the first thing we should consider?
Definitely the first thing we should consider is our structure.
And when you talk about structure in the context of glass, what do you mean more specifically?
Well, using the baseline for that definition of what structure is, that is something that supports the object or load. In this case, we need to understand what that load is. And to talk about what that load that we're able to support, we need to talk about vacuum. So when you remove air from inside of a vessel, you create a vacuum, which is a low pressure environment. So then we're talking about pressure now. What does that have to do with all of this? Well, pressure is the force that is created when atoms, molecules, or particles strike the walls of their container. The less you have of these particles, the less pressure you have, and vice versa. So again, when we're talking about vacuum, we are comparing the pressure inside of a vessel to which that is outside, known as atmospheric pressure. The atmosphere is basically a collection of various air particles, and that weight exerted at sea level, where most of us tend to live at, is about 14.7 pounds per square inch, or at the pressure of 760 torr.
And some of these numbers might not mean much right now, but we'll talk about the units of pressure and vacuum and how they come into play in Chapter 3.
We also have included a link in the show notes with a free copy of the book Basic Vacuum Practice, where the first chapter covers fundamentals of vacuum in greater detail.
What would you say our vessel is supporting? Is it vacuum or atmospheric pressure?
Well, Ben, the answer is atmospheric pressure. A vessel under vacuum then has all that force exerted on the outside rather than equally on both inner and outer surfaces.
I guess you could think about that like a submarine, which is underwater, and we think more about the water pressing down from the outside than we do about the air trying to escape from the inside in a way. So, if the structure of our vessel can't support that atmospheric pressure, what happens?
Well, what happens is that structure will break down, and what that causes in this instance is an implosion. And this is important to know and understand because in order to exercise our creativity in our plasma vessels, we'll need to make our vessel strong enough to withstand the forces of atmospheric pressure and prevent and mitigate that risk of implosion.
And can you describe more specifically what an implosion does and what happens with those particles?
Well, an implosion is an instance of something collapsing violently inward. What happens in this moment is that there's a rush of air filling the vacuum that can carry enough force. And that force, when collapsing inward, has enough that it could become an explosion as fragments of the vessel pass each other and spread outward.
And Percy, you brought up an example in a video forum, will a scratched glass vacuum chamber implode from beyond the press? Tell us what's happening.
Yeah, this is a really cool video. Just because it's able to show you the type of devastation and the violence of what's happening during an implosion. You've probably seen a lot of these science YouTubers present various vacuum experiments, but this one very specifically shows us at a high speed what's happening. So what they have here is a vacuum chamber. Typically that is a dome shape. People use that for removing bubbles from epoxies or resins when they're doing their castings. Sometimes we even use that for, water and silica and plaster mixes for casting. But essentially what they were doing is scratching the surface, which we'll get to later, weakens the glass, and they're trying to see if that would actually cause it to implode. Well, they couldn't get that to happen either. They had the cracks and things happening in there. But eventually they threw a battery at it to see what that violence will look like. And what happened is, in the first part of that video, it just instantaneously turned to glass dust. That's how powerful that force of implosion has on the material of glass. But when they showed that in slow motion, you get this object collapsing inward, almost like an apple core. And as those particles meet the center, they start passing each other and spreading out and going everywhere.
And before this video scares you too much, we do have to say that there are plenty of objects that are under vacuum that we are surrounded by every day. And as Percy mentioned before, anything less than atmospheric pressure is considered a vacuum. And so some examples you might be familiar with are light bulbs, we have neon signs, and also things like canned goods or sealed foods, which have varying degrees of vacuum in them.
Yeah, and as dangerous as this can be, there are only two instances in which the risk of an implosion can occur. The first being during the pump down or evacuation of your vessel prior to filling with the gases, which will start to mitigate with our structure, or two, broken by impact or drop, which happens after the piece has been filled and is on display. But in Chapter 3, Chemistry of Collaboration, we'll talk about how the fill pressure can reduce the dangers of an implosion.
And we'll also include a quiz to review terms and definitions from this chapter. So here's a question for you to think about, listener. How do you think fill pressure can reduce the danger of implosion from impact or drop? Let's discuss some ways to build a plasma vessel to avoid implosion and successfully create a high-quality unit that we can illuminate. I brought up material knowledge a little bit earlier, We talk about aesthetics a lot, but it's good to have an understanding of what's going on at the microscopic level, the glass wall, and the space within the structure. So, Percy, what should we know before we start building our glass vessels for plasma?
Well, Ben, the first thing is safety. So my first point here to add is wearing safety glasses. I don't care who you are, where you work, safety should always come first. Plasma is an experiment, and oftentimes we're working with unknown variables to achieve different effects. And as visual artists, we need to protect our eyes.
Definitely. And the next point, which is pretty important, is that we want to ensure proper seals, closures, and welds in our vessels. We want to avoid any tiny holes or gaps aside from the electrode or the tubulation, which will lead to a weak vacuum and an unsealable or unpumpable piece. So something that we can't light up. And this is the most common issue that both Percy and I have to troubleshoot when we're making plasma vessels or making neon. So we don't want anything getting in or out of that final product.
The next point is having adequate wall thickness. The main idea here is that you know how much glass you have and know how much you can expand that shape. So some things to think about is that you don't want any flex in your glass. You can take, for example, for furnace glass blowing out like a 2-gather to about the size of a softball, no big deal. But you blow that thing out to the size of a basketball or to the size of, a beach ball, that becomes very thin and unstable. So your form and shape can also affect your glass integrity along with its thicknesses. So watch between the contrast between thick and thin, and also we'll introduce some other pointers for vessel geometry in just a little bit. The next point is round is good. It's no coincidence that the light bulb is shaped the way it is. A circle is a mirror of an arch, a tube an extrusion of a circle, and by rotation, a circle becomes a sphere, capable of distributing force evenly.
And we can think to some of those examples that I brought up a little bit earlier, like light bulbs or even the round submarine.
Right. And so a sphere is a really good place to start, which is very natural for us working in glass blowing. There are a couple things that we can do or should be keep in mind is that if you have a concave or a convex surface, you need to watch out for when they're too shallow, because if it's too shallow, it's too flat. To define concave and convex, concave is a surface diving inward into the object. Convex is diving outward from the object. So one of the rules that we came up with, which borrow from architecture, and of course Ed Kirshner, who we'll mention a bit later here, is 1 depth to 10 length as your ratio. Nothing more shallow than that. And there's an example we'll bring up a little bit later as well, which is one of my Nimbus clouds, cloud shape, where you have multiple convex surfaces, which also I had to be wary about how those shapes flatten out or become stretched out, tying back to adequate thickness.
Mm-hmm.
Next up is avoid large flat surfaces. The surface will not equally distribute the weight of your atmosphere. If you imagine a box, the edges of that flat surface will basically support all that weight. The center will bear none of that. And so if you imagine holding a piece of paper and having a heavy coin or a pen, what's really supporting that paper becoming as straight as possible is you pulling on the edges, but the center is all bearing that weight. So to get around that issue, that is, if you must or dare to have a flat surface, is basically adding thickness. The exception, again, another one borrowed from Ed Kirshner, is 1 thickness to 10 length. And then although there are many different workarounds, you can combine various properties to achieve strength. And you may see these in examples of canned goods or boxes that you receive where they have various geometries added into that. So our first example to bring up to illustrate this is Ed Kirshner's Dancing Daisies. This is an example of a blown piece that is a short cylinder of 5 inches in diameter with the faces of the cylinder fairly thick. I think, if I recall correctly, fairly thicker than 1/4 or 1/4 inch. So another example is one that applies to kiln form glass, which you have a vast or very large flat surface. It's lumen glass designed by Wayne Stradman, also produced by Mark Ditzler. Some of the examples that may come to mind would be like these flat plasma discs that you would find now at Walmart, or if Spencer's still exists, you could find at Spencer's gift store.
Yep, I found one of these for $30 for a mini plasma button. And one thing that's interesting to think about is in a lot of kiln pieces, we have large flat surfaces that are often the norm. How did Mark and Wayne get around these constraints?
If we're looking at one of the examples from, the plasma disc, you'll notice that there's little beads in there. There's a distinct pattern that happens with that. You'll see kind of lightning dancing around. Well, those beads act as columns or pillars to support that flat surface. In the example we're going to show for Mark Ditzler, he's done objects where he created channels. So there's not a huge flat surface to be supported, but smaller flat surfaces that have their own little columns or pillars built into the design that gives the light aesthetic.
And to revisit surface, are there any other things that we should keep in mind?
Yeah, certainly. One of the things that you all need to keep in mind is checking for the imperfections or scratches or foreign inclusions in your glass. These foreign inclusions can include stones or metal that you may find in your glass mixture. People working in furnace glass may be more familiar with that in terms of having scale come off a pipe, or bits of cord that comes into contact from disintegration of the crucible, or stones from uncooked or improperly mixed batch or production. So mainly here you want to maintain the surface of your glass. Those scratches, chippings, and imperfections create structural weaknesses. This is very similar to how scoring allows you to break piece of sheet glass, or break rod or tubing, and is often used in exercises of controlled braking, such as hot popping. So if it's in your glass and it shouldn't be there, be wary.
And another thing to keep in mind is to watch for stress and compatibility in the vessels you're making. So, like Percy mentioned before, the thickness of the glass can diminish some of the strength of those thinner elements. You want to watch for bits and any transitions between thick and thin. A good idea to think about are punties that can easily pop off. So the rest of your piece could as well. Make sure that the color and the glass types you're using are compatible with each other. And this can include things like the glass color, the glass type, and the electrodes, which we'll cover in a little bit. So try to stick on the safe side. Putting your glass under a vacuum is the moment of truth. And all these components will come into play in the next chapter, where we'll put our glass vessels under a vacuum, we'll fill them and illuminate them in chapter 3. Now that we've covered the basic requirements for making a glass plasma vessel, we'll talk about the aesthetic considerations of the vessel after a short break.
Hi, I'm Emily, the Assistant Director of Glass Education Exchange, aka GEEX. Are you learning or teaching glass in the middle of a pandemic? That's right, I'm talking about COVID-19. GEEX is here to support the present and ongoing needs of educators and co-learners through virtual programming and resources, including our GEEX Talks lecture series, our calendar of public glass-related events, community spotlights, and other programming like our monthly book club and weekly movement class. All of our programs are free, donation-based, or low cost to increase accessibility. You can check us out on the web at geeks.glass and on all social platforms as Geeks Glass. That's one word.
And we're back. At this point, you're probably wondering what your actual plasma unit could look like.
Yeah, think about the natural overlaps within your own practice as we discuss some of our considerations to the form of your vessel. You'll want to have the final sculpture in mind. This will allow you to plan out your steps, and then you can experiment with a variety of techniques and this will allow you to generate a wider palette to work with through which you can apply them.
Let's look at one of your plasma pieces, Percy. This is Onus from 2019, blown glass, steel chain, and noble gases. And we have 2 versions up right now.
Right, so generally that's what it is, those 3 items in play. You have this blown bubble that is expanded into a set of welded chain, in which the bubble of the glass will expand where it's not constricted. I tend to like using the idea of double meaning with words, whether I enjoy that from certain musical artists or storytellers. So the word onus or onus is how we let our burdens own us and how we allow those things to control us. Mm-hmm. So this piece has a lot to do with constrictions and burdens.
And what I like about this piece is that the light has this quality that has a duality to it where there are these white cords that are going between different elements, sort of going across the space inside the vessel that feel kind of, they feel very pure and very light and sort of optimistic. And then you have these more dampened, these more like organic red patches that feel more like resistance, and they feel more fleshy and angry and hot. So I do like that there's a sense of contrast and a sort of complex relationship that's going on within the vessel itself.
Yeah, and this is an evolution of the piece, or a part of an installation I used in my BFA exhibition, which I talked a little bit more about that in the Chapter 1 notes.
And I like it because this is one of the many outcomes that can be created with the quintessential plasma unit, which we can think of as the bubble. What is the scale of this piece?
Well, relatively, it's a little bit bigger than a basketball, so about 11 by 8 by 8 inches in volume.
Okay. So there are a few considerations that we can think about using Onus as an example. We can think about how the light is coming from the inside out. So how we're viewing this piece. The light is not always as strong as a regular neon or fluorescent light that we might be used to. And I'd say especially with this piece, I feel more subdued or intimate relationship with the sculpted light, just because you do have to get up and close to it to notice these interactions that are happening between the light, the material, the glass wall. And it's also good to consider that scale that we're looking at with Onus and how it might also be reflected across a bunch of other examples we talk about in this episode.
Right, so scale often comes from the capabilities and limitations of the artist, maker, their facilities, and the technology we'll be implementing.
And although we do have some constraints in scale, it's also good to think about interaction and that more up-close nature of the work as a site for play, or having some sort of back and forth between the work and the observer. So how would you describe the light within Onus and some of the other illuminated plasma pieces that we're going to show for this episode?
Well, Ben, the best way to describe the light is by its behavior. We can describe the light on a spectrum of attributes between a glow discharge and an arc. Glow being the mist-like illumination that fills the volume of a vessel, and an arc being the filaments or strings of moving light within a vessel. Your vessel is going to give shape to that gas, which can contribute to a variety of effects and behaviors. Gases will often light up in spaces they're more comfortable with, and may behave differently when squeezed in or through tight spaces. For example, neon can display a different color arc along with its classic red and orange glow, and this can be seen in the change in volume the light actually inhabits. Also, transformer output may also contribute to this as well, but that requires a bit more research and development to really understand. And as you can already tell, many factors come together to contribute to the final result. You'll learn more about those in the next chapter.
Let's talk about some aesthetic considerations to make when combining geometry, surface, and the internal light.
Certainly, geometry will determine the space that light occupies within the interior volume or vacuum of your vessel. So some characteristics to think about with geometry are open and constricted. Modulating between narrow and open spaces can affect how the arc of light can behave in a vessel. Figurative and abstract. Do you want the light to take center stage, or do you want to incorporate the light in a greater story? And scale. A good size to start working with, well, especially in the hot shop, is anything you can manage with one assistant. No smaller than a softball, but don't go any bigger than a basketball. Again, we're trying to stay within our limitations and start working with this process. As you become more familiar, you can go bigger.
Mm-hmm. And here are some characteristics to think about with surface. So the surface you create will help you generate the light effects you're looking for. And we can think about translucency, opacity with the internal and external light, clarity and distortion, whether that be lensing or texture.
And as of yet, thickness of your glass hasn't really shown any effects on the plasma other than optically.
And then we can also talk about clear or color.
Yeah, with color, it has a lot to do more with your planning for the light portion, which we will kind of cover in the next chapter through alchemy of mixing gases. But in general, start out with clear first. By spending time working and getting down the form and process in clear, you won't waste any color when you're ready to make that transition. And it would also be smart to test colors out for translucency, as some colors can be quite dense, making it hard to see through without a bright light.
And now let's look at some example pieces that combine clear glass with the primary gas mixture of neon in different ways. So the first piece we're looking at is Plasma Moose Trophy, which is a collaboration that you've done with Chris Ahalt in 2020, this year.
Right, and this is a piece that is, well, completed in 2020. The project started back in 2017,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, it was the main thing here that we're seeing in this image is, of course, you have this blown moose head that's mounted on a 3D printed plaque. And what's happening is you have an illumination coming from the back of the head, spreading out through the antlers, and then from the antlers, there's an arc or light blue or white light that spreads out into red tips on each of the points of the antlers.
Mm-hmm. And there's a nice subtle surface variation that gives that information for the moose face. So I would describe the geometry of this being more realistic and less like cartoonish or abstracted. And I like that the geometry is kind of performing in both ways that we brought up before, where the light is both figurative, where the vessel kind of takes the form of the moose, especially in the face. But then you can also see that the constrictions and the constraints are altering the light quality and the antlers through how shallow the glass is on those ends versus how open it might be in the middle. And the next example we're looking at is the Chalice of Chaos by Ed Kirshner and Bernd von Meyer.
In this piece, we have a chalice. You're seeing an entire hollow object.
Mm-hmm.
Starting from the bottom, you have a nice small foot that slopes upward into a thin decorative stem with some, lines or scalloping in that texture.
Mm-hmm.
And then it goes into a low or flat bowl or cup. And this is all made on the lathe with flame-worked glass, filled with the same red neon gas, but is exhibiting a different effect, different behavior. So if we're starting at the bottom where we have the foot, you have the nice red ring that's going around the edge of the foot. Going in the centers is light blue or white light, and as it comes into the cup, the bowl of the chalice, you have these blue lines, these blue arcs, turning into these little sprouts of red tips that encircle in a pattern around that hollowed bowl.
And it's really beautiful how the neon gas is adapting to all these different geometries through the maybe more open areas near the cup in the foot, and then those more constricted areas. And this is all just one gas, which I think is really great, is that the gas really will react depending on the placement and those constrictions. And I like this because it touches back on Ed Kirshner's background as a figure in the plasma art field. A lot of his other works incorporate geometry as a primary way to get these extraordinary effects out of just simple gas combinations, which I think is really nice.
And also note that Ed isn't a glassblower. He may have started some practice in glassblowing. Much of his work is a collaboration with many different people to create his pieces.
Mm-hmm. And this is our next example, Touch Me Gently by Fumi Amano, who's one of our 2020-2021 GEEX Talks artists. So we're looking at a clear glass uterus and set of, can't forget what they're called, but
ovaries.
The ovaries, right. And it has a soft neon glow throughout. I would describe the geometry as fairly open. It sort of gets a little bit tighter at the top as the main channel sort of goes out into the ovaries. But I like this piece because it focuses on the glass vessel as more of the sort of the figurative element. But using the neon gas fill emphasizes the uterus as the symbol of femininity, as the reproductive center, and especially with having the electrode sort of placed near the bottom and giving a really even fill, it does make the reproductive system feel sacred. And the documentation is nice in the images we're looking at because it does incorporate a hand, so it shows how the hand sort of acts as another element that can interact with this piece and encourage some sort of dialogue between the two. And the next piece we're looking at is a collaboration that's ongoing with John Sharvin and you, Percy.
Yeah, this is more of an early study, taking some shapes that John Sharvin has been fascinated with and made a blow mold for in the hot shop. So we have these icosahedron and dodecahedron geometries that are attached together, these two shapes. Again, we're looking at something that has like a lot of flat surfaces, geometric flat surfaces. Imagine a geometric spherical form made with triangles and others made with pentagons. And so it's given us a different effect here for the gas. So the gas is the same red mixture we've seen in the previous examples. And what's amazing that's happening here is we get these different lines that are occurring at the edges of those intersections.
Yeah, there's a very nice sort of relationship where the inside has more of this soft diffuse glow, and then the sort of edges of those surfaces are all accented with this nice hot point or line.
And let's not forget that, again, using these different flat surfaces, we're creating shapes or compounding shapes that help improve our structure. So before on the avoid flat surfaces, there are more research that you can explore and expand on this.
And you can think about geodesic domes in architecture. So maybe a biome for a jungle that's inside or a nature preserve. Or you can even think of the Epcot, the iconic Epcot shape is just a bunch of small repeating flat surfaces that create a general structure that is still worthy of holding up all of that weight. And then lastly, we can look at a neon tube. So we have here a simple bent shape that has two electrodes on it and a pretty even line just from a consistent interior geometry. A lot of neon is done from carefully bending and welding prefabricated glass tubes. So we can think about that gas distribution and illumination as being pretty even throughout. And we'll talk about some differences between neon and plasma in more detail in the next chapter. Let's talk about electrode attachment and placement. They're an integral part of vessel crafting. As a reminder, what is the purpose of the electrode in the plasma vessel?
Well, Ben, the electrode is the conductor in which electricity enters or leaves an object or substance or region, so it allows us to power our plasma vessels.
Mm-hmm. And what are the common forms of electrodes that we would use in plasma?
At this moment, the most commonly used electrode is a neon electrode, which is also used in neon signs.
Mm-hmm. And we have an image up right now. So we're looking at a neon electrode that's about maybe 3 inches or 5 centimeters long on the main component, with a diameter that can vary from about 8 to 16 millimeters.
Yeah, the material is a soft glass enclosure with a metal shell suspended by 2 wires that are running externally to connect to power. It also has a small 5 millimeter tubulation sticking out from one end. The electrode serves 2 purposes for electrifying the piece and provides an easy outlet to connect the glass vessel to the plasma manifold. The tubulation is a smaller tube that connects the electrode to the manifold, but it is also a term for any tube protruding from a vessel in this process. There are also borosilicate electrodes that are similar to neon electrodes, but you will have to manually add your own tubulation. Additionally, there are other methods, such as capacitive coupling. Capacitive coupling is a process of transferring energy to light a piece without an electrode, such as using electrically conductive materials and high-frequency fields. This method still requires a tubulation, but in any case, 90% of the time, you will be using tubulated electrodes to power your piece. Mm-hmm. And we will discuss the capacitive coupling in further detail in the next chapter, as it combines elements of technology, such as power supplies and transformers, alchemy, which gas fills, and material knowledge, such as interfacing power through the glass wall.
And where can we start with adding an electrode to our piece?
For attaching your electrodes, you would need to start with welding your electrode, either by tubulation or directly to your finished vessel. A weld is a process of joining 2 connections, with a smoothly and ideally seamless transition of even thickness. The tubulation weld, this consists of pulling a tubulation on your glass vessel and welding an electrode to it. You will have to contend with the tube sticking out of your piece. Some of the benefits are it being an easy entry point to developing your welding skill, especially for furnace glass blowing. Once out of the annealer, you can prepare your workspace to weld in a more comfortable position, as well as taking your time.
Mm-hmm. And we have an example up right now to see what this process looks like. So here we have a video of plasma artist Harriet Schwartzbrock, who is welding an electrode onto one of her hot sculpted glass hearts. So before the weld, if needed, this is where you'll decide if you need to score and cut down your tubulation. When you do this, you'll want to have a clean, even tubulation if possible, trying to match up to the lip of that neon electrode, which will make your chances of a successful weld much greater. And the best practice is to have your tubulation made for the design of your piece. So keep in mind where you're going with your torch and how easy it'll be to cut a section to get a nice even match. And also, you'll want to secure your glass for easy welding and placement using soft weights that are fire resistant or clamps. And you can see here in the video that Harriet's using a scientific stand to gently prop up her glass piece so she can easily access it with her torch and also her electrode. So during the weld, you'll want to attach a blowhose to your electrode tubulation so you can have easy air access. And then you'll begin heating both openings to try to match the temperature before joining the glass together. And if you're working with furnace glass, you'll want to preheat that as it will most likely be thicker than the glass on the electrode. I have a marker trick that I use that I learned from doing neon repairs to slowly bring the glass to melting temp by marking your glass before you're heating it with a Sharpie on the edge and using a torch to slowly heat up those sections. As the glass gets warmer and approaches 450 degrees, the marker will begin to evaporate on the sections that you've heated. And you'll use this as a visual check just to make sure that you're getting your heat all the way around your glass piece. I also recommend wearing didymiums to carefully watch the temperature of that molten glass. If you're working with these smaller torches, there's often a lot of light that's coming out of those torches. So I recommend that. And then you also want to make sure that you're just double checking to keep the electrode nice and warm. You might have to heat up both separately before you can get them nice and close, as you can see Harry's doing in this video. And then once you've joined it together with an even heat on both ends, you'll want to make sure that you're heating all around those joints, gathering it, so slowly pushing it in a little bit, and then lightly puff and adjust the electrode alignment to create an even wall. And I've included an image here of a long neck bottle that I added a neon electrode to. You can see that the glass is generally tapering down on the side of the vessel to match that of the neon electrode. So you'll really want to make sure that you see a pretty nice even connection. There's no clumps or extra thicknesses on any sides, as that might lead to popping off. So just keep that in mind as a guideline. And then once you have a satisfactory weld, you'll want to turn your torch down to a fluffy stage by turning down the air oxygen and start slowly cooling down that connection between the tubulation and the electrode by hitting the torch on all sides with the fluffy flame so you can cool down through that stress point, and also use the torch to deposit soot as a bit of a temperature indicator and a flame annealer. And then after the weld, if you can, re-anneal the piece to make sure that you have that integral structure.
Next, I will walk through direct welds. In furnace glass blowing, this is done while the piece is hot, and before you're actually putting it away in the annealer. What we have here is a video taken while Ben and I were teaching at the glass factory with Ed Kirshner and Jaime Guerrero, and it has myself adding a electrode directly to a student piece. A student piece is kind of a large, misshapen bubble giving various surfaces. And I am attaching that while Ben is on standby, giving support and adjustment whenever I need it. So before the weld, it's important to make these considerations. Plan. And if you're working with an assistant, plan and communicate all the steps. Ensure that you have adequate heat in your glass, because once you weld that electrode on, you will immediately have to put it away in the annealer. So once you have yourself situated, heat at the opening of the glass first. This tends to be a lot thicker, and so it takes a little more time to heat up. Once the opening is hot, you can start to heat the end of your electrode. Now during the weld, you're carefully attaching the hot electrode to the glass object and you're pressing lightly. This process is very similar to the tubulation weld, but additionally you're kind of blowing for that smooth transition between those both surfaces. You're kind of pulling and pressing as needed and adjusting for alignment. So instead of having this 90-degree angle of a connection, you want that nice smooth transition from the electrode's thickness to the thickness of the glass. That will reduce any stresses that may pop up in the process of annealing or getting the piece ready to anneal. And of course you're going to hold it there until there's no movement in that glass joint, and then after the weld you're going to put it away in the annealer immediately, making sure not to break the electrode off along the way. As you can imagine, there's a high risk when welding directly. So things like experience, material knowledge, and preparation are required to pull this off successfully. And you can't easily undo if the electrode breaks while attaching to the hot glass.
There are definitely some trade-offs when you're deciding how to weld that electrode.
And control is the utmost important when adding electrodes, so work at a scale that you can manage. Now, considering the recovery time for a tubulation versus the recovery time for a direct weld, think of it like this. The tubulation is like a candle. You can light it, you can snuff it, you can light it multiple times. But a firecracker, you light that once, it goes boom once. So in this case, you can make several adjustments, but when you're ready to make that direct weld, it's all or nothing. And then you can also check out my updated article for more information on each of these methods.
And then can you quickly revisit the compatibility between electrodes and the glass we're using?
Certainly. So when welding electrodes to tubulation or directly, you can use just about any available neon electrode for soft glass or soda lime glass. These are often very compatible with the glasses I've used, which are Spruce Pine, Spectrum, System 96, Crystallica, and Glasma. And one thing you need to check for is whether it's leaded or not leaded. The leaded glass for the electrodes tend to melt a lot softer temperature. Lead has a lower melting temperature. So you may need to adjust your torch for that temperature, but also adjust it for its finickiness for reduction. So you're balancing between gas and air, fluffy, and moving towards a more oxygen-rich flame, and adjusting your torches involves some trial and error. But then when we're talking about borosilicate electrodes, of course, you're going to match that with borosilicate glass.
And at this point, you're probably wondering what kind of torches you should use.
Yeah, and generally, one that you can handle from a fine to a fluffy range. You don't want something super big, right? You'd want something that you can really fine-tune the size of the flame. So the size, make, model isn't very specific. It's typically what's in your studio.
Mm-hmm. And for tubulation welds on soft glass, I highly recommend looking for a neon hand torch. It creates a fine point of heat on two sides of that weld or that connection simultaneously. And one thing to keep in mind with that is that you want to make sure that you have a neon hand torch that has a big enough torch head, as there are tipping torches which have a fine tip that works great for that 5mm tubulation on the neon electrodes and attaching pieces to our plasma or neon manifolds, but it's probably too small to use on a hot glass or furnace glass attachment. So you want to look for a larger torch head there. And also note that these torches work with gas and air versus gas and oxygen. So it will take some more time to get the glass warm to work, and you'll want to spend more time in your welding process and in the cool down with the annealing. So just keep that in mind, that it will take a little bit more time, but you also have more control as you're working that glass.
Exactly. You can see some crossovers between neon and plasma in this case. But for direct welds, I recommend either the Nortel Ranger or the mid-range hand torches. These are common in most hot shops and furnace glass blowing studios that I've been to, especially back home at ISU and here in Pittsburgh. Both can be dialed in for easy enough welding on your electrode. What I don't recommend is using a map gas torch. Some uses, they work just fine. They give you a low heat, but in this case, we need to be able to get that glass hot enough to make that attachment now, because we're running on the time of the temperature of your overall glass, as this is the last step. But we can't forget about the flame workers, right? You can do many of your welds with your torch. That should be pretty apparent so far. But I do recommend having a hand torch nearby for a little bit more versatility to get in those hard-to-reach spots. And I've written a blog post for guidelines for attaching electrodes, which you can check out in the show notes.
So take note that in this process, you'll be spending a lot of time vessel crafting and adding electrodes before you start to fill your pieces. With that, there is a high failure rate, especially during the electrode placement, where you can face cracks, leaks, and breakages depending on your welding process and handling of the glass between those steps. So practice attaching electrodes on test pieces with some of these methods before you attempt them on a finalized piece.
Right, and when scheduling for filling your vessels, be sure to have several vessels on deck. That means batch your pieces. In this art practice, we're often told to work in multiples rather than one-offs. So as precious as your ideas are, it's good to maintain a practice of making more than one.
Now that we know how to add an electrode, is there anything else we should think about?
You should consider the electrode placement since that can affect how your piece is lit and how the light performs. You're balancing both the aesthetic and functional placement, as the electrode will be the primary origin of your arc or light. Think about it like this: large to small, in to out. The placement of your electrode is most effective if it's near the largest volume and most center to your form. And a good framework to think about this is lighting from the trunk and not the branch of a tree.
And I have a literal plasma palm tree that I made where the electrode is placed at the base of the tree. So towards the top, the light gets softer as the leaves radiate outwards.
And many of the examples we've included in this episode utilize this tried and true method to illuminate their vessels. The first example we'll bring up is the Plasma Move trophy that Chris Aholt and I collaborated on, where we're lighting from the center of the piece from the back of the head in alignment with the typical trophy animal image. It's very symmetrical, even light from the placement, and you're getting the most bang for your buck.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also the example of Touch Me Gently by Fumi Amano, as well as Handful of Amano's Dream, which is another piece that Fumi created with plasma and blown glass. It's an image of a small baby that has been rendered in clear glass with the electrode attachment where the umbilical cord would be. And so in Touch Me Gently, Fumi has placed the electrode near the bottom of the uterus. So I would say in both of these cases, the electrode placement concentrates the power or the life of the piece. In this case, the electrode placement is making more sense overall than just the sense of powering it, but the overall geometry too. So when you're thinking about your electrode placement, you can perform in more ways than just powering your piece. You can also think about how that overall concept works.
And then you'll want to experiment. See how different electrode placements affect your illumination of your piece, depending on what you're looking for. Further discussion on electrodes will continue in Chapter 3, but next up we do have some practice exercises. These are quick forms that you can make that will be able to practice your tubulation and direct welds. To preface, these are mostly for furnace glass blowing, but the principles still apply to flame working. Now the first exercise is 10 pulled neck bottles. This is a shape that many glass blowers should be familiar with, in which you're blowing a ball and then pulling a neck, in which that will become your tubulation. Make 10 of these. Make enough that you can make a way to practice your welding when they come out of the annealer. Work towards matching the thickness between the electrode and the neck of the glass. This doesn't mean that you can't do this with thicker glass, just that it may be more difficult and will mean that you have to take a little bit more time with heating and cooling the glass. And this is just one way to think about creating a tubulation. The main idea is to be able to practice your tubulation welds. Like we mentioned before, consider experimenting and looking at different ways that people have manipulated glass. And if you find a cool way to do that, please share that with us. The next exercise will be for practicing your direct welds. We're going to make 10 ornaments, something that you are very familiar with, something that you started out when trying to blow glass. So you're going to blow a ball or a globe without any extra shaping around the size of a softball. Add a tight constriction at the opening that is about the size of the electrode you'll be using, which is roughly between 8 and 15, though I really recommend that all practices start with larger electrodes, such as 15 mil. Then there are two ways you can do this exercise. First is just to break it off on a knockoff table, just like you would for an ornament, but instead of putting on a hook, you'll practice putting on an electrode instead. And number two is if you're working with an assistant, punty up the ball or globe and practice welding onto the piece.
Now, while it's on the punty, you'll need to ensure simple and clear communication with your assistant. And this is especially important when you're practicing your direct welds from many different angles or positions, letting them know when they should turn, letting them know if they should heat up before you make your connection, things of that sort. But a key note is that when practicing on the punty, this is going to be your very last step. So ensure that you have adequate heat in your piece, as you'll need to put this away immediately after welding on your electrode. And then, of course, if you're maybe considering flashing the piece, though I don't recommend it, this can also lead to a risk of deforming your electrode. And this is why we emphasize that this is your last step.
Mm-hmm. And I have a more general exercise that anybody can benefit from, and that is to practice 20 end-to-end welds with a torch. So in soft glass or borosilicate, you can practice making clean, hollow welds with your torch between two tubulations of whatever you have on hand. We want to make sure and look for a seamless transition between those two glass pieces, thinking about an even wall thickness, making sure that there's no extra thickness on any side, and also in the process minimizing reduction or boiling the glass, so making sure that you're carefully tuning your torch for the best result. And then lastly, to make some drawings while you're listening and thinking about this episode. We'd like you to think about how you want to shape your light, as there are so many factors involved. It's a good idea to start brainstorming now on the vessels that you'd like to build, as it might give you a clearer sense of how to utilize the whole tool set when we discuss alchemy and technology in the next chapter. And it's also important to note that it's okay if you don't have all the resources you need to get started right now. A lot of these aspects are learned to apply, so you can think about illumination, but maybe you don't need to have something that is plasma right away. All right. To summarize chapter 2, we've gone through the processes to get started with making your vessels. We discussed what a plasma vessel is and what it does. We set some guidelines to safely and effectively create a plasma vessel. We provided some aesthetic considerations and examples. We talked about the various methods and considerations for attaching your electrodes. And we gave you some exercises to try out the process.
Vessel geometry, surface, and electrode placement are only a part of the equation of making a plasma piece. Alchemy, such as filling the vessels, and technology, powering the plasma vessels, are two additional factors that may affect how a piece lights up. The definitions and approaches we provide today are not exhaustive of what plasma is or can be. These are some general guidelines for you to begin creating your vessels and getting started on your plasma journey. The more people practicing, discovering, and sharing what they learn, the more the craft of plasma and its community can grow.
And we're excited for you to tune in to the next 2 chapters in the series. Chapter 3, It's Lit, Chemistry of Collaboration. So now that we've introduced how to make a plasma vessel, we'll go over the alchemy that takes place when we bring our plasma units under a vacuum and the considerations when mixing for various effects, as well as utilizing technology to illuminate and energize the vessels. And then lastly, Chapter 4, Starting Your Plasma Journey, where we'll cover the basics of building a plasma setup, and we'll learn more about Percy's journey as a self-starter along the way.
This chapter is a combination of experiences and teachings from various groups of people in both neon and plasma alike. So this information is just the beginning of trying to make sense of something that requires so much knowledge, so much practice, equipment, and time to manage. And with this point, we appreciate your feedback and input, as we are both beginners in plasma and neon and glass at some point. We appreciate that perspective as we put together this easy-to-apply guide.
So let us know how the exercises go, and tag Taming Lightning and GEEX when trying them out or listening to the podcast.
Send questions you may have about alchemy and technology of filling and illuminating your pieces for Chapter 3, or any questions you might have so far. Of course, check out the episode notes and worksheets for more information. Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate all the hard work you putting into this.
and helping me put such a difficult subject into words and making this into a guide.
Definitely. And thanks, Percy. I feel like I've learned a lot of these finer terms recently, just talking and revisiting them with you. And also, it was a great opportunity to try some of these out for the first time last year. So it's been a real pleasure to have you and share your knowledge with GEEX and the larger glass community. So we'll talk to you soon in Chapter 3.
GEEX and Taming Lightning are making a 4-part episode series that's functionally a survey or lecture in podcast format. Percy has produced Taming Lightning for 3 years with 30 episodes released. Percy has a full-time job in the hotel industry and uses his spare time to generate this content. In a few episodes, he literally goes the extra mile and travels to provide a personal touch to the conversation. GEEX believes the glass community is incredibly lucky to have this resource, and it's our goal to replace that luck with financial support. We have an initial goal of raising $2,800 to support this 4-episode series. That translates down to 100 listeners chipping in $7 each per episode. We hope that you'll support Percy's expertise and help us establish precedent by compensating valued voices in the field. Every donation really counts. We have a link in the show notes to get started. If you're on a computer, click the donation button on our Taming Lightning page. If you're listening on the go, send a Venmo donation to @GeeksGlass with the word plasma. That's PLASMA. Thanks in advance for your support.
Thank you for listening to the Taming Lightning podcast. Music credit to the following artists. The introduction is Boost by Joachim Karud. The intermission is Sunny Side by One. And the credits is The Process by Lakey Inspired. I'd like to thank GEEX for inviting me to collaborate for this series. The director, Helen Lee, for starting the conversation. The assistant director, Emily Leach, whom you've got to hear pop in during the break and at the end. And the graphic designer and web manager, Ben Orozco, whose co-hosting and content management skills have been outstanding and much appreciated. Also, I'd like to thank the Pittsburgh Glass Center for supporting me as a place of research and inspiration, as well as encouraging me to pursue this project, and the Plasma Alliance, where I have an access to a well of knowledge and connects me to some amazing and supportive people. Links for supporting the Intro to Plasma series will be provided in the show notes. Feel free to share, comment, and subscribe. And as always, be safe, be healthy, and be strong. And I'll see you next time.